Next on Accident Investigator, a horrible pileup results in the death of a woman and her child. But the story becomes even more tragic when investigators reveal the true cause of the crash.
These people were just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Then, an old woman is found dead on the side of the road after disappearing from a family party. Was this the result of a freak accident or something more sinister?
One of the possibilities that we look at is if Mrs. Polinsky was possibly down on her knees or even laying down when this vehicle struck her.
And an accident investigator struggles to explain conflicting physical evidence at a crash site.
Tommy.
But the job takes a chilling twist when he discovers who the victims are.
This accident was an emotional struggle for me. I never actually had one involving a coworker.
Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
You can be driving carefully, the road clear, the weather perfect. But you can still be involved in a collision. The other guy doesn't do something he is supposed to do, or does something he isn't supposed to do. You can still be in a crash. Now, there are a lot of things you can do to avoid a collision. First among those is to drive defensively and anticipate problem situations.
On a beautiful May afternoon, Laura Smith, a single mother, is taking her son Jason to his grandparents' summer house for the week. It's only an hour's drive from home. The day looks perfect for a relaxed trip out of town and a swim in the lake. Then, seemingly out of the blue, a motorhome in front of her brakes hard. Laura has no choice but to brake also. Meanwhile, a bus driving behind Laura is coming up fast and desperately trying to keep from slamming into her, but to no avail. Laura's small passenger car folds up like an accordion between the two large vehicles and immediately bursts into flames. Firefighters arrive on the scene and do their best to extinguish the blaze, but it's too late for Laura and her son. Despite the fact that it's his day off, accident investigator Don Carroll is called in by his supervisor.
It must have been a major accident for me to be called off duty to respond to the scene.
The scene is one of the worst Don has ever seen. The small passenger car is still sandwiched between the two larger vehicles and has been burnt down to its chassis. Don also learns that both mother and son have been confirmed dead. Although investigators may be used to dealing with the gruesome task of road accidents, the sight of the burnt bodies is devastating.
It's always tough when I respond to accidents such as this because I have several small children of my own, and anytime a child is involved in a crash, and in this case burned so horribly, it's very tough.
It's now Don's task to find out exactly why and how this terrible accident occurred. At the scene, he has 3 vehicles involved in the collision. Determining what part each of the drivers played in this tragedy is the first step.
I saw that the driver of the motorhome appeared to be in shock, so I decided to go to the bus driver, Miss Albright.
Are you okay?
Oh, I'm okay.
Monica Albright explains to Don that traffic was moving smoothly until out of the blue, the motorhome appeared to decelerate rapidly, forcing both Laura and her to brake sharply. She tried to stop in time, but just couldn't.
When I heard Miss Albright's statement, I was first thinking that maybe she was following the small passenger car too closely, and that's why she wasn't able to stop. But I also considered that something happened with the motorhome. Maybe an animal ran out in front of the car. Maybe the motorhome had a mechanical problem.
Next, a patrol officer informs Don that Mr. Peterson is ready to make his statement.
Mr. Peterson told me that a small red car passed him quickly on the left side, directly in front of his motorhome, and then started to drive more slowly. And then for no reason, the car slammed on its brakes.
Peterson insists to Don that he reacted quickly but couldn't manage to steer clear and hit the red car lightly from the rear. He thought he had avoided the worst, but a second later, he felt the impact of Laura's car from behind. He claims that the errant car stayed in front of him maybe a few seconds, but then the driver accelerated and disappeared.
When I heard Mr. Peterson's story about the red car that the other driver didn't report to me at all, I thought at first that maybe Mr. Peterson may not have been telling me the truth about it. So I knew I had to go look for damage on the front of the motorhome.
Found this basically yellow and black transfer marks. I'm not sure what it's from, but it's not something I would expect to find on this pristine bumper. There's some indentations on the bumper like it hit another vehicle, but these yellow and black transfer marks are very suspect and possibly from another vehicle.
Don moves on to the scene investigation, looking for any other clue to confirm the presence of the mysterious fleeing car. The road is a mess of debris, but there's also a lot of skid marks, which is no surprise in a pileup like this.
Miss Albright told me it was like a domino effect, where the motorhome braked, the small passenger car braked, and then she had to brake. There was no advance warning.
Then Don picks up another clue. Just ahead of the motorhome, he notices 4 sets of skid marks. A quick look clearly tells him that these marks are still hot and that they don't belong to any of the other vehicles involved.
I thought that there definitely was a 4th vehicle involved, and then I contacted my dispatch center, who put out a be on the lookout broadcast to look for this vehicle that was involved in this crash.
If another car participated in the chain of events that led to the fiery deaths of Laura and Jason, why did he or she flee the scene? And what caused the accident to happen in the first place? The road evidence and Mr. Peterson's testimony lead Don to consider a brand new theory about the accident.
I thought there was a possibility that this may be an actual staged accident that occurred, because this type of accident fits the profile.
Every year in California alone, there's some $200 million in fraud perpetrated as a function of stage crashes. These aren't accidents, these are intentional events. What you got is a criminal that'll drive around and pull in front of a commercial vehicle or an expensive car, someone that looks like they have insurance. They'll stop suddenly, they'll get rear-ended. Now what you got is everyone in the rear-ended car is injured. They'll bring together a group of doctors and lawyers and, of course, witnesses who'll make this a very multidisciplinary, a multi-jurisdictional effort. That's what makes this such a difficult case to prosecute.
Coming up, Don enlists the help of a fellow investigator in the hopes of untangling this unusual case.
These people were just innocent people who were on their way to a party and got caught up in all of this.
Are you declaring an emergency, sir?
Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
A terrible accident on a busy roadway has claimed the lives of Laura Smith and her 5-year-old son, Jason. Investigator Don Carroll has been brought in to reconstruct the chain of events that led to their deaths. As a next step, Don requests a full mechanical examination of all the vehicles. But his priority is to find the red car that reportedly fled the scene of the accident.
This type of accident fits the profile, in which case a car slams on its brakes in front of a very expensive vehicle, either a commercial vehicle or a motorhome, a luxurious motorhome, because that is where there's deep pockets, where there's a lot of insurance money that's possible available to them to collect.
To follow up on the criminal angle, Don turns to an old colleague, Marty Gonzalez, chief investigator with the California Insurance Fraud Department.
Stage collisions are very prevalent, not only here in California and in the Los Angeles area, but in a lot of states all over the United States. And the reason they're done is, bottom line, is money.
But even if Marty's sure that this is a staged accident, he also knows how hard it will be to prove it.
Basically, the way they work is there's a person commonly known as a stager who has an in with a lawyer or a doctor, typically the lawyer, and this lawyer will pay this person to bring them cases. The stager's job is to go out and plan these accidents and recruit people who are willing to participate and be in the car when it's going to get hit at 60, 70 miles an hour by another car, or by a large truck, or a big rig. And they go out and they plan the accidents.
While Marty investigates possible criminal rings having links with staged accidents, Don receives the mechanical report. The examination of each vehicle involved in the crash shows nothing unusual. The same day, the autopsy report also comes in. Even for the two veterans, the details are extremely disturbing.
When I attended the autopsy, the medical examiner told me that the mom and the child did not die as a result of being hit in the rear by the bus. They died as a result of the fire that erupted after the crash. And the medical examiner told me that because there was still basically soot inside the trachea, which means that they were trying to breathe. And I was hopeful that it was an instantaneous event, but in this case, it was not.
Typically, there are three problems. One is that the amount of oxygen in the air in a closed space fire decreases because the fire is consuming so much oxygen. The second problem is that oftentimes in car accidents, when things are on fire, they release chemicals into the air that can injure the lungs directly. And lastly, the heat from the smoke and the heat of the environment can cause direct thermal damage to the lungs themselves.
The car doesn't burn for no reason except in the movies. Here, Laura and her son were particularly unlucky. The bus hit the back of the car, and that's where the fuel tank's located. It ripped the fuel tank open. Fuel and air and a source of heat, probably from the bus, the engine, the brakes, something like that, caused the fire. This chain of events coming together left Laura and Jason with little chance of survival.
As the weeks go by, the chances of finding the suspect vehicle begin to rapidly decline. Don and Marty exhaust every angle of the investigation, going over the crash scene reconstruction, looking for anything that they might have missed. But the case is also widely covered by the media, and that's how police get the break they've been hoping for, an anonymous tip.
There was a lot of publicity on TV about the accident because of the fire, and it was not too long after that the police department received a call from an anonymous person saying that they believed that the accident was staged, that it was done on purpose, and they knew the people that were doing it.
With all of the roadway evidence, the statements given by Miss Albright and Dave Peterson, and now the tip-off, Don and Marty are certain they're on the right track. But they are about to tackle the hardest part of their job. They must prove who was behind the wheel and that he or she intentionally set up the crash.
We utilize a variety of investigative methods, some with information from insurance companies or other law enforcement agencies. Sometimes we end up having the opportunity to do undercover investigations, and those are obviously very beneficial to us because we can be right there with the suspects and we're getting firsthand information, whether they're making admissions to the person thinking the undercover officer is a friend or a co-criminal, so to speak. It's some of the best kind of evidence we can get.
The investigation leads to Norman Miller, a young man from the area who has been involved in staged accident cases before. Over the course of the next few months, the undercover agent reports back with names, dates, and even a boastful admission from the suspect that he had messed up the accident that killed Laura and Jason. The operation is closing in on Norman Miller, but one key element is missing: the car Miller used to commit his crime.
When I looked at the yellow and black marks on the right front bumper of the motorhome, I measured the height of it and I measured the length of it because I wanted to find a bumper that was the same height and the same distance between the various marks.
This information on the exact dimensions of the bumper becomes critical when the investigation finally leads authorities to the discovery of the suspect vehicle in a remote parking lot. The red car fits perfectly with Peterson's description. Feeling the heat, Norman Miller flees the state, but the police eventually track him down in Arizona. With all the pieces of the puzzle in place, Don Carroll can finally say exactly how this tragic chain of events unfolded. On a sunny afternoon, accident stager Norman Miller spots a motorhome, which he believes has all the makings of a lucrative accident. Moments later, he pulls in front of the motorhome and stops, causing the rear-end collision he hoped for. However, this also causes a collision with two vehicles behind the motorhome, resulting in the death of Laura Smith and her young son, Jason. After months of investigation, Officer Don Carroll accumulates the evidence necessary to bring Miller to trial. The case against Norman Miller is rock solid, and he ultimately acknowledges his role in the accident. He pleads guilty to manslaughter and is sentenced to 11 years in jail for the death of Laura and Jason Smith.
Somebody that slammed on their brakes in front of another car to try to cause a crash is the lowest of the low.
People just do really crazy and stupid things for the sake of a few dollars.
Coming up, investigators work tirelessly to shed some light on the circumstances surrounding the death of a grandmother.
You immediately make associations with people you know, so it got very close to the heart.
Hit and runs are difficult crimes to solve. We're looking for evidence on the body, off the roadway, and when we find the car, we'll be looking for it there too. Paint chips are a big clue. Stuff off the body and off the road are going to give us clues like DNA and microscopic evidence. You may want to run, you may not be able to hide. Once they find the car, we're going to be able to tie this vehicle to that wreck pretty much every time.
It's Kevin Polensky's 5th birthday, and his entire family has gathered to celebrate at a local restaurant. But just as they're ready to bring out the birthday cake, Nadia, the grandmother, realizes that she has forgotten the candles. She excuses herself and hurries next door to buy a box at the convenience store. But after about 20 minutes, Nadia still hasn't returned. The family begins searching up and down the roadside outside the restaurant, calling Nadia's name. After searching the neighborhood for nearly an hour, it becomes obvious that she's nowhere to be found. All her son Alex can do now is contact the police to report a missing person. Later that afternoon, officers answer a call from a pair of local teenagers who claim to have found a dead body. It's lying on the side of the road a short distance from the restaurant where the Polenskys celebrated earlier that day. Accident investigator Lenny Simpson is immediately called in to head up the investigation.
When I arrived at the scene, I saw the body of an elderly lady. Didn't take long at all for the police to link the missing person, Nadia Polensky, with the body that was found at the scene. It was obvious that this was not a mugging, it was not an assault, it was a hit and run.
Police catalog more than 100 pieces of evidence at the crash site, including the packet of candles.
Her body was so deformed from injury, you immediately make associations with people you know and with family members you know. So it got very close to the heart.
Nadia's body is found on the other side of the parking lot, several hundred meters away from the restaurant and the convenience store. The family is devastated and can't explain why she would have crossed the road or wandered away.
We don't know if she became confused, disoriented, or what occurred, but she did not go directly back to the restaurant. She attempted to cross the street, and when she crossed the street, that's when she was struck.
After speaking with the family in more detail, Lenny learns that Nadia Polensky suffered from a number of medical conditions, including severe hypertension.
While talking to the family, I questioned them as to whether she had any health problems. They explained that she had had a stroke several years prior, and that she didn't have too much of a problem being disoriented. However, occasionally she did become disoriented.
Especially the elderly suffer from transient ischemic events in their brain where they sort of have a stroke-like situation where they get disoriented and are not sure where they are, and maybe their speech slurs, and maybe that's what happened here.
If in fact Nadia suffered a mini-stroke, this would explain why she wandered off, and it could completely change the circumstances of the crash.
We look at all the information, we look at all the possibilities, and one of the possibilities that we look at is if Mrs. Polensky was possibly down on her knees or even laying down when this vehicle struck her.
It would be very hard for a driver to hit a standing person and not realize it. But unknowingly running over a small body like Nadia's while she's lying down on the ground is a reasonable scenario. These two possibilities would have very different consequences for the driver.
Me and my partner.
Establishing Nadia's position at the moment of impact is crucial. The autopsy results and the evidence on the car that hit her could provide the physical evidence needed to answer many of these questions.
Okay, this is all about injuries. We're looking at this crash for injury patterns. On this particular dummy, what we're going to see is marks on the back, marks on his buttocks, down the legs. This is going to indicate that this dummy was standing up, and you can see here with bumper scuffs, hit from behind when the car came through, as opposed to, for example, laying down or sitting in the roadway. You'd have a different set of injuries. And of course, we tied those things to marks on the car. You'd be able to tell which way he was facing, how he was moving, whether he was sitting or standing or even walking or running when he was hit.
I have got measurements. Now I have to find the vehicle to make that comparison with.
While officers begin collecting and documenting the broken car parts, Lenny examines the crash scene itself. And he doesn't have to look very hard to find a lucky lead.
Lucky? The only thing the driver didn't leave is their driver's license. The tire mark itself was an exceptional, unusual piece of physical evidence that helped us solve this case.
Lenny also has a good idea about how the tire marks were made.
Tire mark came from the right front tire of the vehicle. The impact was significant enough that it bent the metal into the tire. The tire then began marking the roadway very shortly after the impact occurred. And this tire mark continued from the impact approximately 2 miles to the driveway and the residence of Mr. Richard Kelly. We served the search warrant on the house, and once we served the search warrant, we opened the garage door, and there was the car. It had the damage that was consistent with damage of a pedestrian impact, and it was also the tire mark leading right to the tire. Right to the tire.
Finding the car moves the investigation into overdrive. Lenny immediately looks for physical evidence on the vehicle, not only to link it to the collision, but also to establish if Nadia was standing or not when she was hit.
We also, under further examination, found clothing fibers that looked very similar to what Mrs. Polinsky was wearing. We also found blood. We found hair. And we found marks on the car that were consistent, again, with a pedestrian being struck.
But despite the preponderance of evidence, locating the car is just a first step. Next, investigators must put a driver behind the wheel.
Just because you have the car doesn't mean the case is closed. What you have to establish now is who was driving the car at the time the impact occurred.
Lenny runs a check on the license and learns that the car belongs to the owner of the house, Richard Kelly. Interrogated about the damage to his car, Kelly admits that he thinks he may have hit a dead animal on the road. The physical evidence is immediately sent to a forensic lab for a complete analysis.
We would do comparisons, DNA comparisons, as well as fiber comparisons, to help us determine that this was, in fact, the vehicle that did the striking.
Then something else catches Lenny's attention that strikes him as suspicious.
The entire front bumper of the car was gone. We didn't see it at the scene. We certainly didn't find it at the house. We didn't know where the bumper was, but it was missing.
The evidence on the scene leaves investigators skeptical of Kelly's story. But given Nadia's medical history, Lenny needs to keep in mind that she may have been lying on the ground or even already dead when the vehicle hit her. Without concrete proof one way or the other, the entire case could ultimately be ruled an unfortunate accident. Coming up, Nadia's autopsy report provides key answers and sends Lenny on a hunt for new clues.
I had to absolutely do the best I could ever do to resolve and solve this case.
A birthday celebration turns into a nightmare when the body of 70-year-old Nadia Polinsky is discovered on the side of a road. Accident investigator Lenny Simpson believes he's found the car that hit the grandmother, but he still can't say if she was standing, laying down, or even dead when she was hit. He'll have to wait for the autopsy report to find out. Meanwhile, Lenny must put a driver behind the wheel of the suspected vehicle. He continues to search the inside of Kelly's car for more clues.
We found a cell phone. We also found a receipt from the restaurant. The restaurant receipt that we found inside the car on the console had the restaurant name, it had the date, and it had the time. The time that the credit card was used to pay for the meal.
The credit card belongs to Richard Kelly. This is a very important clue. It places Kelly at a restaurant located only 6 kilometers from the scene just a short time before Nadia was hit.
We went to the restaurant. We had a photograph of Kelly. I was able to talk with the waitress that actually waited on Mr. Kelly. She positively identified him as being the person that she had waited on, that he had had somewhere between 5 and 6 beers to drink in a short period of time. And what we were also able to establish is that he was there with a woman. This woman could have been the last person to see Kelly driving the car before the impact occurred.
Following his instinct, Lenny wonders if maybe Kelly called the mysterious woman before they met at the restaurant.
We subpoenaed the records for the cell phone, and we were able to establish who Mr. Kelly called, what time they called, and what date they called.
The phone record check pays off. Before and after the time of the event, Kelly called the same number many times. This number belongs to Jane Thornton, Kelly's girlfriend.
I expected Jane Thornton was the woman who had lunch with Richard Kelly. And to my surprise, I found out that was not the case at all. She was at home waiting for him to come home to dinner, but he never came home. And when she found out that he was having dinner with another woman, needless to say, she became very upset.
Jane Thornton is now eager to cooperate. She informs police that Kelly did call her that day and told her he may have accidentally hit an animal. This would seem to support the theory that Kelly didn't realize he'd hit Nadia in the first place. But then Jane goes on to reveal that Kelly pleaded with her to drive by the scene and retrieve any missing car parts. This strikes Lenny Simpson as extremely suspicious. The autopsy report now becomes critical. If the evidence shows that Nadia was standing at the time of impact, it will be enough to bring a hit-and-run charge against Richard Kelly.
When you're down on the ground and you're run over, you have very different injuries than if you're standing up and you're struck by a car.
The autopsy report clearly shows Nadia's position at the time of impact. The fractures to her legs were both above the knee, suggesting a standing position at the time she was hit. Her pelvis, ribs, and skull were fractured on the left side, consistent with a collision of this nature and speed. The injuries inflicted by this violent crash are all consistent with the damage on Kelly's vehicle and responsible for Nadia Polensky's untimely death.
The autopsy report proved that she was upright, that she was not bent over, and that when she was struck, she was standing straight. It was a hit and run. It involved a death. The person who struck this woman did not stop. I knew this was going to be my career case.
The next morning, they receive a tip from a concerned neighbor.
We got a report from one of the neighbors that lives on the same street as Richard Kelly. And this neighbor explained that he had found a bumper.
Biological matter, including hair and blood, will be sent to the lab for analysis, but Lenny has no doubt about the results.
Kelly attempted to hide the bumper so that we could not have it as physical evidence. He was trying to prevent his arrest.
After a week of investigative work, Detective Lenny Simpson can finally replay the events that led to Nadia Polensky's untimely death. On that fateful afternoon, Kelly heads back to work after having lunch and several beers at a nearby restaurant. As the elderly Nadia Polensky crosses the road, Kelly slams into her, sending her body flying through the air and landing on a pile of trash by the street corner. But rather than assist the injured woman or call the authorities, Kelly drives away. Several hours later, he returns to the scene, and rather than check on his victim, he hides evidence in an attempt to cover his tracks. The autopsy report shows that Nadia Polensky died as a result of several head and spinal cord injuries. Richard Kelly is finally found guilty of a hit-and-run accident resulting in a fatal injury. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail.
It became an obsession, and that was probably because of the family. They had lost someone who was near and dear to them, and to die such a violent death was just not fair. So I felt compelled. I had to absolutely do the best I could ever do to resolve and solve this case.
Coming up, a reconstructionist faces one of the hardest cases of his career when he's called on to investigate a car crash involving his best friend.
Despite my emotional feelings in this, I knew I had to continue with this investigation and complete it.
Accident investigators are used to dealing with bloody scenes, dead bodies all the time. But there's nothing like investigating the death of a fellow officer. It's like investigating the death of a family member. And there's no one that can do that job but the accident investigator himself.
At the end of a long day, Officer Marty Keene is patrolling a quiet neighborhood waiting for his shift to end. Everything seems to be going smoothly when suddenly, something catches his eye in the rearview mirror. He swings a quick U-turn and drives back in the direction he came from. As it turns out, Officer Keene has stumbled onto a major car accident involving 2 vehicles, one of which has caught fire. He can't wait for emergency personnel to arrive. The burning vehicle could explode at any minute, and he must get the driver out fast. As medics arrive on the scene, the passenger from the other car staggers out into the street, but the driver is not responding.
Yo, we got help. Here.
Officer Keene is transported to the hospital along with the crash victims. However, for driver Fred Niedermeyer, it's too late. He's pronounced dead at the scene.
Responding to the scene of a 2-car accident, my dispatcher advised me that my best friend Marty tried to save one of the drivers in the accident when the vehicle caught on fire, and he suffered smoke inhalation and had to be transported to the hospital himself. Marty Keene, he's my best friend. I've known him for about 8 years. He's the one that got me into doing the accident investigation.
In fires, there are 2 things that happen. You obviously can have direct thermal injuries where your actual tissues are burned up. But what most people die of in fires is smoke inhalation. And there's sort of 2 things that are going on. One is that you can breathe in smoke, which, depending on what's burning, can have toxic chemicals in it. And the second thing that happens is fire's hot. And so what you can be breathing in is very, very hot air. And what that can do, and often how people die in, say, flash fires or very, very hot fires, is they take in one breathful of hot air and their larynx swells shut. So they can't get any more air in, and that's how they die.
As he arrives at the scene, Officer Jones receives more alarming news about the crash.
It turned out that the driver of one of the cars was another one of our police officers named Tommy Erickson. Despite my emotional feelings in this, I knew I had to continue with this investigation and complete it. With Marty in the hospital, there was no one left. We were the only 2 accident investigators.
Officer Jones is immediately faced with several critical questions. Were drugs or alcohol involved? Could this event have been caused by a mechanical failure? Or was one of the drivers at fault? All of these answers will be hard to come by and could have major ramifications for the drivers and their families.
I've responded to many accidents before, many serious accidents, but I've never actually had one involving a coworker or even my best friend at this point.
The first thing Officer Jones notices is that both vehicles are in the same lane. Sheriff Erickson's car is sitting on the curb, while the other vehicle has come to rest in the middle of the lane, facing in the wrong direction.
When I looked at Tommy's car, it was up against the curb. The front end was smashed on it, and it looked like some fire damage to the front end. I looked over to my left, and I saw this small black car on the wrong side of the road in the lane it looked like Tommy was traveling in. And my first impression, it was a head-on collision.
But as Officer Jones examines the stretch of roadway behind Sheriff Erickson's car, he observes some peculiar skid marks that are not consistent with a head-to-head crash.
Normally in a situation like this, when it is a true head-on collision, the marks would just be straight. They wouldn't be on an angle like they were on.
Then Robert notices something else unusual. While Tommy's car has left strange angled skid marks, he can't find any signs of braking from the other vehicle at all. This is very puzzling. Why on earth would Niedermeyer just plow straight into Erickson's car head-on? Tragically, Robert will never have the opportunity to ask his colleague Tommy Erickson about the crash. The sheriff is pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital.
When the officer told me that Tommy had died, I was devastated, but I wasn't totally surprised. After the examination of the car, it was difficult for me to understand how anybody could have survived the impact that he suffered on the steering wheel.
As Officer Jones crawls around the scene looking for physical evidence, he discovers tiny gouge marks in the roadway.
Anytime there is a severe impact, you usually have gouge marks because the front end of a car will go down and will actually impact the surface, and it'll cause it to dig in and cause these gouge marks. And it generally tells you the direction the car was coming from or the direction the car was at the time of the impact.
But the gouge marks that Robert sees here are not making sense. From what he can tell, the car that made these gouge marks could not possibly have been involved in a head-to-head crash.
The undercarriage of this car had drugged the asphalt in a way that was not consistent with a head-on collision. I thought this was very important to this investigation.
The positions of the cars tell Robert that it was a head-on collision, but the minimal brake marks and the gouges in the road suggest otherwise. Robert hopes that the vehicle inspection will shed some light on this physical evidence and the possibility of mechanical failure. But for now, Robert has immediate concerns. He heads to the hospital to check on his partner and the one surviving victim. After a troubling day with many unanswered questions, he's finally given some good news. His partner, Officer Marty Keene, is still unconscious, but recovering from his injuries in intensive care. Expecting to find the one surviving passenger in critical condition, Officer Jones is amazed to see him sleeping peacefully. His name is Arthur Curtis, and his chart notes that he has only suffered one minor injury, a broken nose.
I was a little surprised when I found out that Arthur had just had a broken nose. Seeing how both drivers had died in this collision, something just didn't seem right to me.
The interview with Arthur Curtis provides more clues.
I could smell alcohol on his breath. I asked him if Fred Niedermeyer had been drinking also. And Curtis told me that they had both come from a bar right down the street from where the accident happened. The toxicology report indicated that Fred Niedermeyer had consumed quite a bit of alcohol. His blood alcohol level was a 0.18, which is considerably over the legal limit.
The blood alcohol content could explain the lack of brake marks from Niedermeyer's car. Perhaps he was just too drunk to react to the oncoming vehicle. It may also shed some light as to why Niedermeyer ended up in Sheriff Erickson's lane. But it still doesn't explain why the passenger, Arthur Curtis, only suffered a minor injury, or why Erickson reacted to the oncoming car so late.
It appears that Tommy just locked the brakes up and tried to turn away from it just right at the last minute, like he never saw it coming. I had a hard time trying to figure that out.
Next, Officer Jones gets Fred Niedermeyer's autopsy results. It notes that Niedermeyer was not wearing his seatbelt, leaving his body unprotected against the violent shock of the crash, resulting in a lacerated aorta.
Car A hits car B, and all that force from car A gets transferred to person in car B. The bodies inside the car keep moving and hit something inside the car, and then the organs inside the bodies keep moving and hit something inside the body. So it's boom, boom, boom.
Well, that crash was only at 35. Imagine if it was a lot faster, like Sheriff Erickson's. In every crash, there are 3 collisions. The first one's between the car parts. The next one is bodies striking structures inside the cars like the steering wheel and the dash. The last one is where body parts strike internal body parts like the ribs. Your heart and your lungs striking the ribs can cause blunt force trauma. That can lead to internal bleeding, and that's what killed Sheriff Erickson.
Coming up, inspecting the undercarriage of the car yields new evidence.
I placed the black car, Fred Niedermeyer's car, up on the rack to inspect the suspension components and to also find out what caused the gouge marks in the road.
An off-duty sheriff is involved in a deadly car crash that kills him and another driver. The resting position of the car suggests that it was a head-on collision. But the rest of the physical evidence says otherwise, creating a real mystery for the investigator. As a first step, Officer Jones needs to run a complete mechanical check on the vehicles and document the damage from the crash.
I'm driving over to the garage now to do the vehicle autopsies on the two vehicles involved in that crash. Right now, the best evidence I have are the 3 gouge marks in the road. I want to look underneath that vehicle and find out what caused those gouge marks.
The brakes and operating systems check out okay, so mechanical failure is ruled out. But the question remains, why would 2 cars collide head-on with virtually no attempt to avoid each other? Officer Jones's next job is to painstakingly match the marks on the road with the cars and parts that caused them. This giant jigsaw puzzle should give him a fairly accurate sense of the crash dynamics. While inspecting the undercarriage of Fred Niedermeyer's car, he finds his first important piece of the puzzle.
What I discovered is the marks right here in the suspension are what caused the gouge marks. There's actually pieces of asphalt still on the metal components underneath this car. When I looked at the gouge marks again and saw the angle they were coming on, I was able to determine that Fred Niedermeyer's car was actually coming on an angle and not directly head on.
So it's a blue there, right there.
This is a major breakthrough in the case. With Niedermeyer's angled gouge marks and the offset skid marks from Erickson's car, Robert now has a clear idea of where the cars were at the time of the impact.
It appeared to me that Fred Niedermeyer was actually making a left turn or making a long sweeping turn into a driveway access, and he turned right in the path of Tommy. That explains to me why Tommy never reacted to this crash.
The force generated in a head-on collision would have been so violent that no one would likely have survived the crash. This left turn finding explains why the passenger in Niedermeyer's car wasn't more severely injured. The impact was absorbed primarily on the driver's side, leaving the passenger side mostly free of this deadly force.
The evidence left by the skid marks indicate that Tommy actually swerved to the right just before the collision.
This discovery puts Niedermeyer clearly at fault. But one mystery still remains. If it was a left turn collision, how did Niedermeyer's car end up in the opposite lane facing Erickson, creating the illusion of a head-on crash?
Tommy's car was actually 10 miles an hour faster and 1,000 pounds more than Fred's car. And that explains why Fred's car went so far backwards and wound up in the lane that Tommy was originally driving.
It was this weight and speed disparity and the resulting backwards movement that made the crash look like a head-on collision. The pieces are all coming together for Officer Jones. This new theory explains the victim's injury patterns and the absence of roadway evidence, as neither driver had much time to react to the other's vehicle. With the final piece of the puzzle in place, Officer Jones can now replay the events that led to this unfortunate tragedy. Fred Niedermeyer and Arthur Curtis spend the afternoon drinking beers at a local bar.
Wow, cut their heads off.
Soon after leaving, Niedermeyer slows down to make a left turn but fails to check for oncoming traffic. The impact of the collision lifts Niedermeyer's car off the ground, pushes it backward, causing it to land in the center of the lane facing in the wrong direction. The pieces all fit together for Officer Robert Jones, but the solution only came after a lengthy and emotionally draining investigation. Thankfully, Marty Keene eventually makes a full recovery, but sadly, both officers' thoughts are with the relatives of Sheriff Erickson and Fred Niedermeyer. No criminal charges were filed in this case.
This accident was an emotional struggle for me because a coworker was killed in the accident. A friend of mine was injured in the accident. Once I completed my investigation, I was relieved to find out that Tommy wasn't at fault in any way, shape, or form in this accident.
This was a difficult case for Robert on a number of levels, professionally and emotionally. Don't be fooled by that appearance of callousness and coolness the accident investigators show. Deep down, remember, they're human beings as well. They care about getting that guy off the road that deserves to be off the road because they drive as well and so do their families.
Next on Accident Investigator, a woman dies after her car plunges into the cold waters of a river. But a troubling phone call to the district attorney's office 2 weeks later starts this case moving in an unexpected direction.
For them to call me at the scene, I knew it had to be a complex case. It would take a great deal of investigation.
Then, investigators are called on the scene of a puzzling hit and run that has left one man dead underneath the car. But with no witnesses and little road evidence to go on, investigators have more questions than answers.
We had a victim that was underneath the car. Was there anybody else in the car? Were they the sole occupant of the car? Who was driving the vehicle?
And a woman walking on the sidewalk is hit and killed by a car that left the road for no apparent reason.
What I found astonishing about this crash is the car had traveled such a long distance without any input from the driver.
Was there a problem with the car or with the driver? Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
This truck's a mess. It's rolled over, it's been hit once, probably twice on the side. Can you imagine what it was like inside this truck for the occupants? Well, somebody has to, and that person's studying occupant kinematics. Now, occupant kinematics is all about how people move inside a car. We can use it to analyze seatbelt issues, airbag issues. Now, sometimes it can come into play in more mysterious cases, where even the very nature of the crash is a question.
It's after midnight on an empty stretch of road when a woman notices a man frantically trying to flag her down. She's a little reluctant to stop, but as she draws closer, she can hear the man pleading for help. The man tells her that his car has gone off the side of the road into the river, with his elderly mother still inside. Within minutes, a local trooper arrives on the scene.
It's down there, down there. Where?
But by the time they get back down to the car, the body is nowhere to be found.
He said that he'd spent some 15 or 20 minutes swimming up and down, searching for his mother, trying to get her out of the car.
Please, somebody, as soon as possible.
The man identifies himself as Anthony Salter. At the time of the accident, his elderly mother had recently undergone hip replacement surgery, and Anthony decided to move back into her house to take care of her. When he tells the police about his failed attempt to save his mother, the officer is impressed by his calm behavior and ability to recall all of the details of the incident. At the hospital, a routine checkup shows that Anthony hasn't suffered a single injury from the crash. The doctor is surprised by these findings, and the escorting officer decides to take photos of the examination. The next day, Anthony receives terrible news from the police. Earlier that morning, his mother's body was found washed up on the riverbank. On first blush, Marion Salter's death appears to be a tragic accident. But 2 weeks after the crash, District Attorney Rick Esser receives information that puts a doubt in his mind.
The first phone call that was of great benefit to the investigation was one from an insurance agent.
The agent explains to the DA that Anthony had recently increased his mother's life insurance policy and that he seemed desperate to get his hands on the money. From that moment, Rick decides to completely re-examine the dynamics of the crash.
While we had our doubts about the defendant's story, we wanted to see if the laws of physics demonstrated that is this person a valid suspect or is this likely an accident? That's why we had Joe Hancock get involved.
Crash reconstructionist Joe Hancock usually works in another jurisdiction, but he is quickly identified as the best man for the job.
They wouldn't waste my time, and I wouldn't waste their time. For them to call me at the scene, I knew it had to be a complex case and that it would take a great deal of investigation.
Joe is a specialist among specialists. His field of expertise studies the body's movement inside a vehicle during a crash, a science called occupant kinematics.
In the information that I received from Mr. Esser was that Anthony had advised the investigators that he was driving his mother home from a bridge game. She had just recently had a hip operation and she was under medication. But as they were traveling down the road, he was traveling approximately about 70 miles per hour when he must have fallen asleep. And when he fell asleep, he drifted off the road and he did not wake up until his vehicle was just entering the water.
When Joe begins his reconstruction, 2 weeks have already passed since the accident. Thankfully, local authorities have done a thorough job documenting the scene. To determine whether or not the crash was really an accident, Joe has to analyze the 3 most important factors in occupant kinematics: the crash scene, the vehicle, and the occupant's injuries.
One of the things that Mr. Esser did was show me photographs taken very recently after the crash of Mr. Salter. And immediately I saw that this person had no marks at all on his chest or upper body.
Joe suspects that this photograph might be a highly valuable source of information, but he can't make any assumptions without first looking at the other elements of the crash.
I needed to see the scene.
Hello.
Joe heads over to the crash site with the investigator who first mapped the scene. Detective Eddie Verdon shows Joe where Salter claims his car went airborne and jumped into the water at around 110 kilometers per hour.
Looking at the tire tracks and looking at the scene, my experience told me already that this did not happen the way Anthony had described. First of all, if a vehicle did go off a cliff at 70 miles per hour, the vehicle would have almost cleared the river completely and landed on the other side.
But Detective Verdon informs Joe that the vehicle was found in the water only 5 meters from the shoreline. Both men agree on one thing: the car had to be traveling at a much slower speed than Salter claimed.
Now, of course, that does not mean that he is lying. He has been involved in a traumatic crash. He has lost his mother. He could have a hard time remembering correctly. My job is to not really dwell too much of what Anthony said, but what does the physical evidence tell me?
Joe's next stop is the embankment. At the base of the cliff, he can easily see where the vehicle left the cliff and came down. Then, on the edge of the shoreline, hidden between the rocks, Joe makes an amazing discovery.
I noticed that there was debris from a vehicle still in the rocks. I then identified a headlamp assembly, some molding from the luggage rack, and an antenna from a motor vehicle.
This unexpected find sheds a whole new light on Joe's investigation.
Seeing that, I knew that this vehicle did not actually hit water first, but it hit the base of the cliff first. This area at the base of the cliff was roughly about 7 to 8 feet from the base of the cliff, so the vehicle went off at a very low speed.
This clearly disproves Anthony's recollection of the speed he was traveling, but it still does not contradict his basic version of events. It's entirely possible that the car simply slowed before plunging off the cliff.
We were able to determine that the vehicle left the cliff roughly about 19 miles per hour and hit the bottom of the cliff at 22 miles per hour.
Meanwhile, at the DA's office, Rick Esser receives a phone call from a woman introducing herself as Marion Salter's former private nurse. Mary Ross says she decided to call the DA after she learned about Marion's death in the newspaper. She informs Rick that Anthony had let her go a few months earlier, saying that he couldn't afford her services anymore.
Good afternoon.
According to Ross, Anthony kept complaining that the costs related to his mother's condition were forcing him to postpone his own retirement. Coming up, the investigation takes a shocking new turn when the results from the autopsy are revealed.
Well, when I saw the amount of medication in her system, I then understood that she was basically passed out. She was quite asleep and anything could have happened.
A woman suffers a horrible death when the car she and her son are traveling in drives off the road into a river. Clues at the crash site and interviews with family members have led investigators to suspect her son's version of events. But so far, there is little concrete evidence that would suggest any wrongdoing.
Even if he's lying, does not mean there's anything else about this crash, but I need to do a complete reconstruction.
Then, the autopsy reports come in with shocking findings. While confirming that the victim died from drowning, it also shows that there were abnormally high levels of sedatives in her blood.
Well, when I saw the amount of medication in her system, I then understood that she was basically passed out. She was quite asleep and anything could have happened.
This information is a major break in the investigation. While Anthony's mother was taking pain medication for her injured hip, the levels were far beyond the prescribed amount, suggesting that someone may have tampered with her dosage in order to render her unconscious. But despite mounting evidence of foul play, the only thing that can prove it one way or the other are the kinematics of the crash itself. The next step is to analyze the damage to the vehicle.
As I approached the front of the car, I did notice that there was severe front-end damage. It's starting to confirm for me that the vehicle hit nose first.
On the right front of the car, one headlight assembly is missing, while the one on the left-hand side identically matches the model Joe found on the embankment.
I then noticed that the antenna fit into the receptacle for the antenna. And I also noticed that the weather stripping for the roof rack did match up to the crashed vehicle.
Joe next turns his attention to the numerous scratches and bumps found on the car. For this veteran accident investigator, reading those marks is like reading a book. And soon Joe is able to precisely reconstruct the dynamics of the crash.
Well, I also noticed in my observations of the car, scrape marks that were in a circular pattern. So it does confirm to me that the vehicle hit nose first, pivoted on the nose, and fell on the driver's side of the car. And then the scrape marks all along the side, the driver's side, well, that tells me that the vehicle then slid into the water.
At this point, Joe knows how the crash occurred. But in order to reconstruct the truth, he will need to determine exactly how this squares with the injuries to the occupants. And this is where Marion Salter's autopsy report might be the key.
I saw that Marion had bruisings on both her left and right knees. She had bruises along the shin of her right leg. I then can match those up to contact points in the car. Here and here.
On the passenger side of the car, the history of Marion Salter's final moments is clearly written.
So it looks like her knees came in and hit the dash here, that the ashtray is broken.
All the marks that Joe finds on the passenger side are consistent with Marion's exact injuries. They also indicate that the victim was not wearing a seatbelt. But Joe suspects that the final clue may lay on the driver's side. Since he saw that photograph of Anthony's unharmed chest, Joe has been mystified as to how he could survive an accident of this magnitude virtually unscathed. This is the crux of the entire investigation. If he can prove that Salter was not in the vehicle at the time of the crash, it will be enough to bring charges against him.
If he's not belted in the car, this is what should have happened. He should have hit the steering wheel like a person falling off a two-story building. You would have seen contact points of his body against the steering wheel in the column. We did not see that.
The absence of marks shows that Anthony Salter was certainly not driving this car unbelted when it went over the cliff. But Joe still has to rule out one last possibility that could be raised in Salter's defense. What if Anthony was actually wearing his seatbelt?
So in this case, we don't have any marking from a body on the dash or the steering wheel. Now, in a lower speed crash with the seatbelts, that's what seatbelts are for, and so it should be preventing that kind of contact. but that's going to leave some sort of marks on the body where the belts come across your ribs and across your waist. What we're going to do is an experiment here with the belts and the dummy. We're going to go ahead and take this belt, and we're going to put chalk on it to show where it would mark what's called the D-ring here. And we're going to also have the belt across the dummy and see how he loads that belt in the crash. Let's see how my buddy the dummy did. Okay, so let's see how my buddy the dummy made out. We're gonna look at the belts, and you can see where the belt actually made contact. You'll see it in the footage. There's a mark on the chest and on the stomach here. And then at the point, and this is exactly right, at the point where the belt went through the D-ring, you can see where it scraped away some of the chalk, and there's actually a little blur, a little smear mark there. That's from the body loading a belt. That's what we expect to see when we have a driver.
In Anthony Salter's car, the driver's seatbelt is still in perfect condition. And with this photo that was taken on the night of the crash, Joe was able to prove that Anthony didn't sustain any bruising.
If he was belted in the car, he should have had these bruises across his shoulder. That did not occur.
We had such a mountain of evidence against him, we decided to place him under arrest. We had no doubt that he was going to be convicted.
During Anthony Salter's trial, Joe Hancock reconstructs his version of the crash for the jury. He leads them step by step through the sordid details of Anthony's intricate plan to murder his mother.
A staged criminal act had taken place.
Late one night, Anthony Salter is driving his 81-year-old mother home from her weekly game of bridge. He most likely offers her a drink that he's heavily spiked with sedative, and within minutes she is asleep. Anthony is familiar with the road and knows the exact moment to pull off where the ground begins to slope toward the small river. He stops just long enough to get out of the car, leaves it in gear, and then watches as the vehicle begins to roll. The car falls over the cliff and hits the embankment, twisting and toppling into the water. As the car slowly sinks out of view with his mother trapped inside, Anthony scrambles down the embankment and splashes muddy water on himself. A few minutes later, he is flagging down a passing motorist for help.
Joe's accident reconstruction was the pièce de résistance, if you want to call it. It's hard to refute the laws of physics.
The jury is quickly convinced, and Anthony Salter is sentenced to life in prison for the premeditated murder of his mother. Coming up, investigators are on a hunt for clues to explain how a man ended up dead stuck underneath a car.
We had a victim that was underneath the car. Was there anybody else in the car? Were they the sole occupant of the car? Who was driving the vehicle?
In car crashes, body movements occur in a split second, literally in the blink of an eye. Did you see where the dummy was in this crash? Did you see how close it got to the steering wheel when the airbag deployed? In a crash test like that, high-speed cameras can document a sequence happening too fast for the human eye. But in the field, there's no high-speed cameras. It's up to the accident investigator to use good observations and make the right deductions, particularly in occupant ejection cases where you're trying to figure out who might have been driving.
It's early on an ordinary Monday morning, and two kids are taking a shortcut on their way to school. But as they move through a densely weeded area, they spot something in the brush that turns out to be anything but ordinary. Minutes later, police secure the scene of a fatal car accident. A vehicle is flipped on its side in a ravine with one man pinned down underneath. Leading this investigation is crash reconstructionist Tom Stoley.
My main role is to gather facts, information, evidence to determine all of the elements surrounding this particular crash. We had a victim that was underneath the car. Was there anybody else in the car? Were they the sole occupant of the car? Who was driving?
As officers search the area for other ejected occupants, Tom notices the overgrown weeds and realizes that the car is barely visible from the roadway.
The first thing that struck my mind was, how long had this been there? It could have been hours, it could have been days.
A paramedic confirms that the man is dead and has been probably for a few hours. But taking the corpse away at this stage could potentially disturb crucial evidence.
I decided to keep the body in place until we had a chance to really go over the scene and gather everything we could.
There are several items strewn around the site. A couple of empty beer bottles and unopened packs of cigarettes litter the area. Further up the ravine, a baseball cap has also been thrown from the car. Inside the vehicle, the contents of a wallet are spread out, and police quickly find a license that reveals the identity of the victim. The name Alex Trevino is well known to the police. He lives with his uncle, Gene Mitchell, and their home is regularly visited by officers answering calls related to public disturbances and drunken brawling. Alex and Gene are rarely seen without each other, and around town everyone knows who they are. The car is licensed to Gene, but a quick check shows that Alex is registered as a second driver. As police try to contact Gene Mitchell, Tom directs his attention to the physical evidence on the roadway. Analyzing a pair of tread marks left on the asphalt, he is able to visualize the events leading up to the crash.
As it enters the curve, it goes into a side skid. It's rotating. It's where the rear tire crosses over the path of the front tire. That's why they get wider here.
Such traces of rotating motion lead Tom to one conclusion. The car entered the curve traveling way too fast.
Every curve, every bend in the roadway has what's called a critical curve speed. Now that's a speed that you can't go faster than and still stay on the curve. Now if we know the radius of the turn and something about how sticky the road is, friction, we can actually calculate that speed. So what we want to do is stay inside of that speed. Now we're going to do an experiment here. I'm going to drive through this curve to show how fast we can go and still stay on the curve. So there it is. It doesn't take more than about 5 miles an hour over that critical curve speed, and you're out of control. Those yellow signs, they're there for a reason. Someone's already done the calculation for you. Follow the direction.
Obviously, the driver who caused these tire marks wasn't following directions at all.
I was able to determine the speed of the vehicle, and it was in the neighborhood of 61, 62 miles per hour. More than 30 miles per hour, the speed limit.
It's also clear that in order to shear off a utility pole like that, there had to have been a massive impact. As an accident investigator, Tom's role is to make sure that every aspect of the crash matches up with his observations. The car's left front and back wheel rims are broken, probably due to it sliding sideways. And the damage at the rear end of the vehicle is consistent with slamming into the utility pole. But as Tom finally authorizes the removal of the victim's body from the scene, he is surprised to see that Alex's body shows no sign of injury.
It was fairly undamaged for this type of collision.
Tom then receives confirmation that no other victims, dead or alive, have been found in the surrounding area. Naturally, this would suggest that Alex was traveling alone and that he was the one driving the vehicle. But Tom has his doubts.
Well, one of the first things that drew my attention was the victim was clutching a pack of cigarettes in his hand, and the driver was trying to steer through the curve, trying to steer back onto the roadway. How do you do that with a pack of cigarettes in your hand?
Tom has a growing suspicion that someone else was driving the vehicle. He requests an immediate check on the crash victims recently admitted to nearby hospitals and starts looking for clues that may suggest there was a second occupant in the car.
I think there's somebody else.
Studying the new pack of cigarettes more closely, Tom wonders if it may have been purchased just moments before the crash.
It appeared to be a fresh pack of cigarettes, like he was in the process of opening them at the time.
Following his instincts, Tom decides to check out a convenience store located just half a mile from the scene, on the exact same road the car was coming from.
That would seem like a logical spot that they may have stopped to purchase these cigarettes.
In an amazing twist, the store clerk tells Tom that Alex Trevino had indeed been in the store earlier to buy cigarettes. And he was not alone. Screening the surveillance camera footage, Tom is able to locate an image showing that Alex Trevino walked into the store with another man. The clerk knows them both well. He identifies Alex's companion as his uncle and buddy, Gene Mitchell.
It was a great piece of evidence because it puts them together just before the crash. And the other important piece of information in the video was Gene Mitchell's wearing a baseball cap.
A baseball cap identical to the one Tom found on the crash scene.
It places Gene Mitchell at the scene and also helps pinpoint the time of the crash.
With this new piece of evidence, Tom knows that a few minutes after 4:42 that morning, Gene Mitchell was riding with his nephew, Alex Trevino, when their vehicle violently left the road due to excessive speed. His next task will be to determine who was driving. And since alcohol seems to be involved, the answer to that question could lead to serious consequences for the surviving victim. Coming up, Tom Stoley relies on injury analysis to determine which one of the two occupants of the car was behind the wheel during the crash.
They were substantial injuries. Most of them were localized to the left side of his body. They were definitely from some sort of car crash.
Investigator Tom Stoley has just discovered that an accident victim found dead on the roadside earlier that morning was actually traveling with his uncle just moments before the crash. But the uncle is nowhere to be found. On his way back to the police station, Tom receives a call from dispatch. He learns that Gene Mitchell has been admitted to a hospital just a few miles from the crash site and is being treated for multiple injuries, including what police call road rash. Tom requests that a blood sample be taken from the suspect and rushes to the hospital.
I want to get the blood as soon as possible.
Road rash is a term that we use in medicine to describe an abrasion. Oftentimes when someone falls on asphalt, they fall off a bicycle, they get ejected from a motor vehicle accident, you will see the skin abraded. Road rash is something that we see very, very frequently.
Okay. Hi, I'm Investigator Stoley. I'm here to meet with one of my colleagues.
Oh yeah, just right there.
At the ER entrance desk, Tom meets with a patrolling officer who tells him that he'd found the suspect about an hour before.
Hey, stop! Hey.
Mitchell had been shirtless and obviously intoxicated, yelling and wandering in the middle of the street. When the responding officer went to talk to him, he quickly noticed severe abrasions across the left side of Mitchell's head, leg, arm, and chest.
He claimed that he had been the victim of an assault. He had been beaten up by one or two other people.
Mitchell's wounds did not appear consistent with this type of assault. There were no bruises or similar injuries you'd expect to result from an attack. But the injuries were serious enough for the officer to take Mitchell to the hospital. Next, Tom interviews the ER physician handling Gene Mitchell's case. Dr. Bill Marciano tells him that both of his patient's clavicles are fractured. Mitchell also has 6 broken ribs, a punctured spleen, a collapsed and contused left lung, and many cuts and scrapes.
They were substantial injuries. Most of them were localized to the left side of his body. They were clearly not injuries from an assault. They were definitely from some car crash.
Injury analysis is a key element in accident reconstruction. And as the doctor enumerates Mitchell's injuries, Tom continues the reconstruction of the crash in the same way as you would build a brick wall, piece by piece.
The way the vehicle left the roadway, one of the first things it did was impacted a utility pole near the left rear of the car. And it would be reasonable that the person sitting in the driver's seat would be slammed against the left side of the car and sustain some fairly major injuries on their left side. That would account for the broken ribs on the left side, the ruptured spleen, and the various other internal type injuries he received. Yeah, certainly.
Gene Mitchell's blood test results confirm that he was highly intoxicated on his arrival at the hospital. If Tom is able to prove that he was behind the wheel at the time of the crash, Mitchell will certainly be facing some serious criminal charges. Dr. Marciano understands the situation and he authorizes Tom to interrogate his patient.
When I spoke to Gene, he gave a couple of conflicting versions of the cause of his injuries and his whereabouts that night. Finally, he did admit that he was with Alex Trevino and that he was in the vehicle. However, he wouldn't say that he was driving. He stated that Alex was driving.
All the physical evidence so far suggests that Mitchell may be lying. But Tom knows that if the case goes to court, he will need all aspects of the crash scene to match up with his reconstruction. And one mystery remains. Why would Alex Trevino's body suffer so little damage in the accident? Back at the scene, Tom starts looking for physical evidence that may help him put that last brick in the wall.
The driver's side window is broken. All the other window glass is intact. The passenger would have had to have been ejected out the driver's side window, as well as the driver.
This single observation solves the mystery of Alex's undamaged body and allows Tom to finalize his reconstruction of the events that led to Alex Trevino's untimely death. In the middle of the night, Gene Mitchell is driving back home from a bar with his nephew Alex Trevino. Severely intoxicated, Gene's reflexes are highly affected, and his car enters a curve at more than 50 kilometers per hour faster than the curve's critical speed limit. Unable to complete the turn, the vehicle skids to the left side of the road and hits a utility pole before it starts overturning in grassy terrain. Gene Mitchell is crushed up against the left side of the car, and his body absorbs all the violent impact. In the process, he acts as a virtual shield protecting Alex Trevino from any bodily harm. After the first roll, Mitchell's body is propelled through the driver's side window and lands violently on the ground. But by the time Alex passes through the already broken window, the car has lost some of its momentum, and he lands softly on the long weeds. Unfortunately, a moment later, the car rolls on top of him, squeezing his body into the spongy turf.
The cause of death was positional asphyxia.
Positional asphyxia occurs when the patient can't get oxygen into his lungs. Sometimes that is due to a heavy object on the chest, so the lungs can't expand.
The autopsy later reveals that Alex Trevino suffered only 2 broken ribs and would have easily survived the crash if the vehicle had not rolled on top of him. Gene Mitchell pleads guilty to criminal vehicular operation, resulting in the death of Alex Trevino. He was sentenced to 4 years confinement plus 5 years probation. Coming up, a woman is hit by a car that seemed to have left the roadway for no apparent reason.
So in a crash like this, you start thinking about different scenarios, how the crash could have occurred, what may have caused it. Was there a mechanical problem with the car? Was he hit by another vehicle that caused him to lose control? And the other possibility is he swerved to avoid something in the roadway.
The human condition often plays a role in crashes. For younger drivers, we perceive them to be reckless, inexperienced, driving too fast. It's a fact of life for those of us aging. We know our eyesight isn't what it used to be, and our reaction time has slowed down a little bit. Now, any one of these factors can play a role in a crash. Today, it's Frank Carson's job to figure out if one did.
On a hot, muggy afternoon, Jane Balfour is busy working in her garden when the sudden sound of metal hitting metal jars her out of her thoughts. She looks up just in time to see a vehicle sideswipe the neighbor's car and continue on down the street towards a parking lot. Jane rushes back into the house and calls 911. When she comes back out, she sees that the car has actually come to a stop, but not before having hit a pedestrian. A passing jogger stops to help the injured woman while Jane checks on the driver of the car.
Okay. My name is Jane.
He's an older man, and while he doesn't seem to have any external injuries, he's only semi-conscious and his breathing is slow. Medics arrive on the scene within minutes and rush both individuals to the hospital. Frank Carson, traffic reconstructionist, is called in to head up the investigation.
After the officer briefed me, I started looking around, and the only thing I could see was the driver's car hit a parked car. They were still stuck together. Garbage can had been knocked over, and of course the area where the pedestrian had fallen down after she had gotten hit. And that's all I had to go on at that point.
Frank's job is a difficult one. He will need to determine exactly why this car left the road and hit the passing pedestrian. His findings could have serious ramifications for the driver, victim, and their families. As a first step, he runs a check on the car's registration, and the owner is identified as Mr. Harold Carlisle, a 68-year-old local man.
He's over there.
Frank then turns his attention to the crash site.
I went back down the road from the direction that it looked like his car came to look for other marks on the roadway.
But there is no roadway evidence of skidding or any other signs of braking.
What I found astonishing about this crash is the car had traveled such a long distance without any input from the driver.
Frank measures over 170 meters of the driverless tire marks.
The car went a long distance, so he had to have been traveling at a pretty decent speed. It's a 25-mile-an-hour zone, and we were able to calculate from the marks on the roadway and other evidence that he was probably going at least 50 miles an hour at the beginning of this whole scenario to be able to travel that far, hit the curbs, hit the pedestrian, and still have enough energy to hit a parked car.
Frank's at a loss. He can't begin to explain the bizarre crash. There's just no evidence to give him a clue as to what might have happened here.
So in a crash like this, you start thinking about different scenarios, how the crash could have occurred, what may have caused it. Was there a mechanical problem with the car? And the other possibility is he may have done what some people do and confuse the brake pedal with the gas pedal.
Accident investigators find themselves working on cases where the driver has mistaken the brake and the accelerator pedal. It may seem surprising, but it happens, and it can lead to disastrous results. Can you imagine being on the freeway and a big truck in front of you slowing, and instead of going for the brake, you go for the accelerator? That's not a good thing. Now, a lot of times when this happens is you find a certain type of tire mark, an acceleration scuff, and accident investigators are trained to identify that. It's different than a braking tire mark. But here, Frank doesn't have either. So what's he going to do? How's he going to solve this case?
The vehicle also shows no damage that would suggest Carlisle had been run off the road or involved in an earlier collision. Next, Frank requests that the car be taken back to the garage for a full forensic inspection.
So the scene information and what the witnesses told me didn't help a lot to answer some of the questions we had. We have a car that's out of control, and we have a pedestrian. And did the pedestrian maybe accidentally step in front of the car? Well, that's something we don't know about right now. And the best way to find that out is going to be to go to the hospital and talk to Mr. Carlisle, see what he might remember.
The case is starting to rely heavily on Stephanie Platt and Harold Carlisle. Coming up, Frank rushes to the hospital in hopes that he can gather more clues.
These are all questions that I have to try and answer, and the best way to answer that is talk to Mr. Carlisle at the hospital.
Mr. Harold Carlisle, a 68-year-old man, is involved in a dramatic accident when he loses control of his vehicle and hits Stephanie Platt. Both Mrs. Platt and Mr. Carlisle are rushed to the emergency room. Accident reconstructionist Frank Carson is heading up the investigation. Testimonies and physical evidence show Mr. Carlisle's car left the road, but it appears that he never tried to regain control before slamming into Mrs. Platt.
So while I'm driving the hospital, I have a couple scenarios to run through my head. What happened to Mr. Carlisle to make him do this? Was he maybe impaired by drugs or alcohol? Did he have kind of medical crisis? Or maybe he passed out?
Or could a mechanical failure have caused the crash? Frank hopes to speak with Harold and Stephanie, the only two people who know exactly what happened. But when Frank finally arrives at the hospital, neither patient is in any condition to talk. Harold Carlisle has been heavily sedated, his body having gone into shock, and Stephanie Platt is still in the operating room undergoing surgery to save her life. Her leg was so severely injured by the impact that it had to be amputated, and her other internal injuries are massive. She suffered serious blunt force trauma.
Blunt force trauma at moderate to high speed is a very dangerous situation for the patient. The risk of serious injury goes up astronomically. You assume very serious injury in multiple organ systems.
The doctors have been able to run a routine blood test on Harold Carlisle, and the results come back negative for alcohol, another dead end. But as Frank turns to leave the hospital, he is flagged down by Tom Carlisle, Harold's son. Tom tells Frank that he'd been expecting his father that evening for dinner, When he hadn't shown up, he tried calling and eventually drove over to his dad's house. He was surprised to find the Meals on Wheels service breakfast still in the bag and untouched on the kitchen table. Frank asks Tom whether his dad was on any medication or suffered from any medical problems. Tom then reveals a very important fact. His father is an epileptic.
You know, when I think of somebody having a seizure, I think of a little thunderstorm inside the brain. You have all these little electrical impulses like popcorn going off in the brain, but they're all going down a pathway, different pathways all over to get from your brain down to your eyes, to your ears, to your mouth, down to your legs, your arms. And what happens with a seizure is there's an abnormal electrical impulse in the brain, like a spark. And all of a sudden, that spark can trigger other sparks.
Frank learns that Harold Carlyle had been on the same prescription drugs for about 15 years, and as far as Tom knows, has never suffered any side effects.
Tom didn't know the type of medication, but he was able to give me an important clue. He gave me the personal physician, Mr. Carlyle, so that's a person I can follow up with and get a little more detail out of.
Frank gets a call from dispatch reporting that the mechanical inspection revealed no faults or problems with the car, and the only significant damage was sustained in the final collision. While the crash scene evidence has now been exhausted, the medical lead is all Frank has left. His next stop is Harold's personal physician, Dr. Bronson. Dr. Bronson confirms that she met with Mr. Carlyle only a month before to check on his medication. Mr. Carlyle indicated that he hadn't been suffering from any seizures or side effects. She is certain the medication would prevent him from having a seizure, provided he'd been taking the prescribed dosage. That's the next question Frank has to answer.
You have to be very careful if you are self-medicating. And the reason for that is missing a dose of medication may be just as serious as taking too much of the medication. And when you're doing that and you get behind the wheel of a car, then you may put yourself at risk, but more often, you may put others at risk.
Frank recalls a snippet from the conversation he'd had with Tom Carlyle about the Meals on Wheels breakfast sitting untouched on the kitchen table. According to Tom, his father always took his medicine along with his first meal of the day.
The morning of the accident, his father hadn't eaten his breakfast. So there's a possibility that since he didn't eat his breakfast, he didn't take his medicine like he was supposed to.
Frank immediately calls the hospital and speaks to the ER doctor. He asks that the blood test include the level of anti-seizure meds in Harold Carlyle's system.
The blood test results could show something very important. If Mr. Carlyle's level of his medication, his bloodstream was too low or non-existent, he could have had a blackout.
The next morning, Frank returns to the hospital. He's advised that Mr. Carlyle is coming around and is now alert enough to be interviewed.
I asked him what I asked most people involved in accidents. Do you remember anything about the crash?
Can you tell me what happened?
Well, the last thing he remembers was hitting a curb or a bump. Next thing he remembers, he's sitting in his car, someone's knocking on the window, and they're putting a mask on his face, and the EMS personnel are there to treat him.
Frank is astonished. Harold Carlyle doesn't remember anything about the crash or the moments leading up to it. That means his car was traveling driverless for a period of time at roughly 80 kilometers an hour. Again, this information fits with the possibility of a seizure, but Frank needs more information.
And I asked him if he remembers the morning, if he had his breakfast. And after saying he didn't remember, he admitted that no, he didn't eat his breakfast. And then I asked him if there's a possibility he maybe didn't take his medication, because he usually takes with his breakfast. And after talking about that for a moment, he finally admitted that no, he didn't take his medication that morning like he was supposed to.
The blood test confirms Mr. Carlyle's admission. The level of anti-seizure meds suggests a period of approximately 12 to 16 hours without medication. Harold Carlyle goes on to admit that he often didn't take his medications as prescribed. Rather, he took them according to his own schedule. This is not the first time that Frank has heard such a confession. He used to be a medic and isn't surprised.
On long-term medication, you're supposed to maintain a therapeutic level of the drug in your system to manage your condition. And if you take your medication on a regular basis, your medication levels go up and down, just like a roller coaster. And that's not a good way to manage your medical condition.
Tragically, Harold Carlisle's failure to adhere to his dosage requirements costs Stephanie Platt her life. Doctors are simply unable to repair damage to her spleen and liver, and Stephanie Platt dies 24 hours after arriving at the hospital.
This is a sad case for the family, certainly of Miss Platt, who was killed in the crash, but also for Mr. Carlisle. He's going through his life managing his condition without knowing that the way he is managing it, by not taking medication properly, could cause a problem like this.
With the final piece of the puzzle in place, Frank can now recreate the tragic events that led to a young woman's untimely death. After failing to take his medication that morning, 68-year-old Harold Carlisle suffers an epileptic seizure and blacks out behind the wheel. His car careens out of control, hops a curb, and slams into pedestrian Stephanie Platt. The violent force of the collision causes massive internal injuries that ultimately claim her life. Frank meets with the state attorney's office to review the case and decide what, if any, charges will be brought against Harold Carlisle.
I met with the state's attorney's office to review the case, and Mr. Carlisle could have been facing motor vehicle manslaughter charges, but because of the circumstance of the case, it was decided not to prosecute him criminally, and Ms. Platt's family decided not to pursue any civil litigation.
Next, on Accident Investigator, a man is found dead in a ditch after being ejected from the passenger seat of a car involved in a strange accident. But the driver's version of the crash does not match up with the roadway evidence.
He has been just through a very traumatic experience. He has lost a friend. He could be confused, he could be disoriented, or he could be lying.
Then, a young woman has a horrible death when her car leaves the road for no apparent reason. Called on the scene, investigators are mystified by what may have caused the crash.
I had nothing to go on at this point. This girl just ran off the road for no reason. There was no evidence on this vehicle whatsoever that she had been impacted or sideswiped by another vehicle.
And the boy is killed when a car leaves the road and violently crashes into a corn stand. But strangely, the uninjured driver remains surprisingly calm.
Listen, Donald, try to get out of the car, okay?
I'm sure he was in shock from having been in a crash, but his behavior just seemed a little bit different from what I'd seen in the past.
Every year, violent collisions kill 3,000 Canadians and injure another 200,000. But there is no such thing as an accident. Every collision has a story, as unique as the people involved. Rusty Haight is a leading authority on accident reconstruction. He trains investigators around the world to read the clues and solve the mysteries.
Accident investigators have to rely on physical evidence when they analyze a crash. Sometimes there are no eyewitnesses, and even when there are, they may not be a reliable source of objective information. They're people, and whether they're drivers or some independent witness, they may have a distorted perspective on the crash. They may not have seen the whole thing, they may even be in shock. They may also be trying to hide something, and that's what Joe Hancock's going to have to figure out in this complicated case.
It's a warm summer evening on a quiet country road, and 28-year-old Jan Taylor is slowly regaining consciousness. Surveying the scene, it's clear he's been in an accident, but the details are still fuzzy. As he gets out of his car, he remembers that he was not alone in the vehicle. His friend Carl Weinberger was in the passenger seat, but suddenly he's disappeared. Searching the tall weeds along the roadside, he eventually stumbles upon the still body of his longtime friend, lying in a shallow ditch several meters into the brush. Accident reconstructionist Joe Hancock is immediately called in to head up the investigation. Joe quickly learns that he's got one dead passenger on his hands and an injured driver. It's clear that Carl Weinberger was ejected through the passenger window and most likely died on impact.
Okay.
The driver, Jan Taylor, suffered only minor injuries, but is sent to the hospital for overnight observation.
When I get a call for a single vehicle crash, based on my experience, I'm expecting to see one car into either a tree, a wall, a guardrail, with one set of skid marks, left side and right side, that don't cross each other. And looking at the roadway, there are numerous tire marks, scuff marks, curve marks, change direction marks, and debris in the roadway.
As Joe inspects the car, he is immediately able to rule out a single vehicle accident. Behind the rear wheel on the driver's side is a long rip. The metal has been peeled back, and the rear bumper has been partially ripped off.
In this vehicle, I noticed severe damage along the driver's side of the car, basically starting from the B-pillar, the pillar right behind the driver's door, and going back towards the rear bumper. I also noticed that the rear bumper was bent backwards towards the rear of the vehicle. And looking at the car, I saw that there was a paint transfer on the car. There was some red paint transfer. And also in looking at the damage, I noticed that the damage was from a movement going front to rear.
Now, Joe is certain he's looking for a second vehicle. This is a clear case of hit and run. In a hit and run, every mark, every piece of roadway debris becomes a potential clue. He knows right away that he's looking for a red car, and because of the extent of the damage, it must have been a larger vehicle. Surveying the site for more clues, he finds another piece of the puzzle, one that confirms his theory about the second vehicle.
I noticed a large pool of fluid on the ground, and looking at the fluid, it appeared to be diesel fuel. I noticed that it then, from the pool, led off in a trail, and it led down the road.
This fuel leak is a tremendous stroke of luck, and Joe immediately orders a trooper to follow the diesel trail. At the trail's end, he finds a truck, parked behind a gas station, about 30 kilometers away from the crash site. He calls in the plate number and is told that the truck is registered to James Higgins.
They found out that the vehicle belonged to Mr. Higgins and his address was very close by to that location.
James Higgins is at home when the officers arrive. He doesn't deny being in a crash. In fact, he admits to panicking and fleeing the scene. But he's not able to recall any details of the crash. He just remembers hitting something. On first blush, the case looks like a cut-and-dry case of a DWI hit and run, and James Higgins could be facing serious criminal charges.
They told me that Mr. Higgins had admitted to being in the crash, but that he had panicked at the crash and went home. And when he got home, he was so upset that he had started to consume alcohol to calm his nerves. The officers, of course, were suspicious and then brought him into the station.
But then, a brief update from the hospital suddenly turns Joe's case upside down. The officer who accompanied Jan Taylor to the hospital calls in with a different statement. Jan is claiming that he was hit from behind and spun out. But this doesn't make any sense to Joe. The damage to Jan's car indicates that he was struck by a vehicle coming from the opposite direction, certainly not from behind.
I would expect to see damage to the rear of the vehicle going rear to front and into the trunk compartment itself. I didn't see that on this car. What I saw on this car was a sideswipe type of impact from the front to the rear. Already I'm starting to think, well, the damage doesn't match up that closely.
But why would Jan Taylor say differently?
He has been just through a very traumatic experience. He has lost a friend. He could be confused, he could be disoriented, or he could be lying.
In his statement, Jan Taylor claims that his car spun around and his friend was thrown out. Joe knows this much to be true. The body of Carl Weinberger was found only a few meters from the impact marks. But Joe has a feeling that Jan's not telling the whole story. Whenever a driver's statement conflicts with the evidence, the crash scene takes priority. Joe turns his attention back to the roadway, and that's when he notices the collision scuff marks.
There was a scuff mark indicating that a vehicle had slid sideways and rotated before the impact.
The roadway evidence clearly shows the car suddenly veering to the left and skidding to a complete stop across both lanes. Then there's a major impact, probably with the truck. The arced marks show that he then spins out again and back towards his lane, at which point his passenger, Carl Weinberger, is thrown from the vehicle. This is a critical finding because it says to Joe that the car was out of control before the collision. But Jan Taylor's saying something else.
Some of the considerations that are still on the table is that this is a crash that involves being struck from the rear. Right now, the physical evidence is not leaning that way, but I have not observed everything, and I haven't done all the analysis necessary to come to that conclusion. And speaking with Mr. Taylor, I'm really hoping to get more information about this crash to help me with my investigation.
Joe heads over to the hospital to interview Jan Taylor. He first examines Weinberger's medical report. It's a tragic scenario that Joe has seen all too often.
The passenger, Carl Weinberger, had died of massive head injuries. These head injuries are as a result of bouncing into the grass. The passenger was not seatbelted. The lateral gravitational forces of the spin caused him to go out the passenger window and fall on the ground. That's what killed him.
Typically, the patients that we see that are ejected from cars are among the most severely injured patients that we have. Most of them have severe head injuries, and those are coupled with severe, typically orthopedic injuries, broken bones, broken legs, and that is also coupled by blunt injuries to your liver and your spleen. So those patients are the ones that we worry about the most. The ones that we don't worry about are the ones that are in the car who have their seatbelts on. Those patients are much less severely injured.
When Joe finds Jan Taylor, he's still recovering from shock and has a nasty bruise on his chest. The bruise explains why he'd survived the accident. He'd been wearing his seatbelt. It's unfortunate that he hadn't convinced his friend Carl Weinberger to do the same. Joe asks Jan to go over the crash for him one more time.
I did notice when I started talking with him that he told me the same story that I had heard over the phone. I'm a crash reconstructionist. I wanted to make sure that he did understand that this crash did involve a fatality, and he did know that his friend had passed away. In speaking with him, I noticed a couple of things. One, his speech was slightly slurred, but this could be due to injury, but I wanted to make sure. But I also noticed his eyes were a little glassy, and that also there was a strong odor of an alcoholic beverage on his breath. If a driver is involved in a crash that results in a fatality, that driver must submit to a blood alcohol test.
Joe decides to wait for the results of the blood test before speaking to Jan any further. Although he suspects that Jan Taylor is hiding something, he doesn't know what or why. To find out more about the crash and Jan's statements, Joe heads over to the impound to begin his inspection of the truck. Coming up, as the evidence mounts, so does Joe's skepticism.
He made it very clear to me at the hospital that there was just one impact, and it was from the rear. I knew that the impact was a side swipe, and my suspicions started to grow.
Jan Taylor's car is involved in a horrific hit and run. Police trace the missing vehicle and the driver, James Higgins, to his home. Higgins admits he left the scene of the crash and immediately started drinking, but he doesn't remember much beyond that. Jan Taylor claims that Higgins' truck hit him from behind. But the evidence shows accident investigator Joe Hancock that Taylor's car got sideswiped, and a set of skid marks suggests that the car was already out of control at the moment of the impact. As the next step, Joe heads over to the garage to inspect the impounded truck.
There was very little or any indication of impact at all to the front bumper. There were still bugs on the front bumper. If nothing else, the impact would have wiped away the dirt and the bugs off the front bumper. I then walked around the truck, trying to look for any other damage, and on the driver's side, I did find a very long scrape and a series of scrapes down the side of the truck. The scrapes had paint transfer from a greenish type vehicle. Also looking at the scrape, I noticed that in the middle of the scrape, there was actually a perforation of the side of the truck. And looking at that and looking underneath the truck, I saw that it actually punctured the fuel tank. This truck does use diesel fuel. It is starting to match up step by step by step, item by item.
Meanwhile, James Higgins is being interrogated by a detective. Despite his spotty memory about the actual crash, he may hold the key to some unanswered questions.
Mr. Higgins told us that he was driving down the road and that this vehicle now cuts him off. He has to steer to the right. There's an impact, and yes, he does leave the scene.
Higgins' story syncs up with Joe's opinion that the accident could not have been the result of a strike from behind. And he adds one important fact. He now admits that he was under the influence of alcohol when the crash occurred.
Yes, he is consuming alcohol, and that could affect his memory, but the physical evidence is supporting what he told me.
Given all the evidence and testimony so far, Joe believes the scenario could have only played out one way. Jan Taylor lost control of his car. He then steered to the right, but overreacted, trying to regain control and spun out counterclockwise into the path of the oncoming truck.
As each step of this investigation revealed what really happened, each time it convinced me that Mr. Taylor's version of this crash was inaccurate.
If Joe's new theory is correct, it would be a critical turning point for the investigation, as it suggests that Jan Taylor, rather than Higgins, could be held responsible for the accident. Next, dispatch informs Joe that Taylor has been discharged from the hospital. but that his blood test revealed he was over the legal alcohol limit. With this new information, Joe heads to Jan Taylor's house to question him once again.
Meeting Mr. Taylor at his house, I then asked him a series of questions, and also I let him know that I knew the results of the blood test and I knew that he had been drinking. In speaking with him, I wanted to know how much alcohol he had to drink and maybe try to convince him that I knew that alcohol was a factor in this case. And in talking with him at his house, he then admitted that he had been drinking and that he had been drinking a couple of glasses of beer and that he also might have had a shot of hard liquor.
After 20 days of investigative work, Officer Joe Hancock now feels he has a clear picture of what really happened the day of this tragic collision. Jan Taylor and Carl Weinberger are on their way home from a bar when Jan suddenly loses control of his vehicle and spins out. James Higgins is also driving under the influence. He sees Jan Taylor's car and steers to avoid it, but manages to catch the side rear end of the car, sending it spinning like a top. The impact causes Carl Weinberger, who was not wearing his seatbelt, to go flying out through the passenger window. He then lands hard in a ditch next to the roadway and succumbs almost instantly to head trauma and massive internal injuries. James Higgins, in a panic, takes off but leaves a trail of leaking diesel fuel from a rip in his gas tank. The state attorney's office looks at the case and agrees that James Higgins is not responsible for the incident. He's charged only with fleeing the scene of a crash. The state attorney suspects that Jan Taylor had been drinking, lost control, and spun out into oncoming traffic. Taylor is charged with manslaughter by automobile and homicide by motor vehicle while intoxicated. However, the jury finds Jan Taylor not guilty and acquits him on all charges.
What helped me in this case is that I talked with the family of Carl Weinberger. I talked with the prosecutors. And yes, we answer their questions.
While the investigators were able to paint a detailed picture of the accident, the prosecution's case against Taylor was unsuccessful. Coming up, a young woman dies in an unexplained crash, but roadway evidence is offering absolutely no clue as to what might have caused the accident.
This girl just ran off the road for no reason. There was no evidence on this vehicle whatsoever that she had been impacted or sideswiped by another vehicle.
Sometimes accident investigators come to a realization that a case they're working on may never be resolved. That's frustrating for the investigator. Moreover, how do you explain to a grieving mother you may never be able to tell her all about the death of her child? That's the kind of situation our investigator Robert Jones is dealing with here.
Maureen Weller is in a fantastic mood. She's just finished her first week on the job as a house painter, and this morning she's learned that she's been accepted into her top choice of colleges. The money she earns on this summer job will help pay for the tuition in the fall. As she packs away her tools for the day, a coworker asks Maureen if she wants to stay for a drink.
Come have a beer. Come on, have a beer.
She joins them on the balcony for a few swigs of cold beer.
Yes.
But Maureen's been feeling tired all week and is eager to celebrate with her parents before she crashes for the night. She takes one last sip and heads out.
Tomorrow, you go.
20 minutes later, police get a call about a car lodged up against a tree in the middle of a field. But the responding officer could never be prepared for the bizarre and shocking scene that awaits him. Maureen is unconscious and has been impaled by a branch. She's still alive, but her pulse is very faint.
And Johnson, Mayfair and Johnson, EMS requested, stat.
Accident investigator Robert Jones is immediately called to the scene.
The police department advised me that a branch had gone through the windshield of the car and the firefighter had to cut the branch away from the girl's neck.
The medics are not optimistic. They think the branch may have severed one of Maureen's arteries and she's lost a tremendous amount of blood. Robert's job is to figure out exactly how and why this freakish accident occurred. His first step is to carefully examine Maureen's car.
I walked around to the front of the car to examine the front of the car. It was lodged up against a tree. There was some minor impact damage to the front of the car, but it didn't lead to any kind of significant speed or anything of that nature.
Maureen's car has left a clear imprint of its final moments. Robert can see where she left the road, traveled into the field, and made contact with 2 separate trees. But what puzzles him most is that there doesn't appear to be any signs of braking or skidding.
The thing going through my mind at this point is what caused this girl to run off the road. I didn't know at this point whether she had been drinking, using drugs, if she fell asleep. It was extremely hot this day. It was 102 degrees. The extreme heat outside can clearly make someone tired.
But it's 6 p.m. It seems unlikely that sleep or alcohol would affect a driver so early in the evening. Robert needs to find more clues to form a theory about what could have happened. He now looks at the larger picture of the crash site. He walks back along the road looking for anything that might help explain why Maureen lost control of her vehicle. But the road gives nothing away. There's no indication of roadway debris or that another vehicle was involved in the crash.
There was no evidence on this vehicle whatsoever that she had been impacted or sideswiped by another vehicle.
Robert starts to get a sinking feeling that finding out why Maureen's car left the road will be a serious challenge. So far, he has absolutely no clues.
I had nothing to go on at this point. This girl just ran off the road for no reason.
Robert asks for the car to be impounded. He'll want to check for any mechanical failure that could explain the crash. Then, just as he is finishing up with the crash scene, Robert receives a call from the hospital. He isn't surprised to hear the news.
I received a phone call from the hospital advising me that Maureen had died from the injuries to her neck caused by the branch severing her neck.
Since there are no forensic clues, Robert requests a blood test and a full toxicology report on Maureen's body. He needs to determine whether she was under the influence of alcohol or drugs prior to the accident. Then he's faced with the tragic task of informing Mrs. Weller that her daughter is dead.
This is the most difficult part of the job, letting the relative know that their loved one has died. I never know what to expect. You know, I don't know if they're going to be angry or just not even believe.
As soon as Maureen's mother opens the door, she knows that something is wrong. This is not the first time she's had a policeman come knocking at her door with terrible news.
Yes, I am.
Maureen's mother was devastated by the tragic news. And when I tried to explain to her a little bit about what happened in the accident, for what little that I knew at that time, Maureen's mother informed me that she had lost a son about 3 years ago in an auto accident.
No.
That was very difficult to deal with.
Mrs. Weller is grief-stricken and unable to provide Robert with much more information than he already knows. Maureen was simply on her way home from work.
I'll call you in a few days and...
Unfortunately, Robert is in a similar predicament.
What made it even more difficult at this point was that I didn't have any answers for Mrs. Weller.
After a full crash scene investigation, Robert is no further ahead on this case than he'd been at the start. What could have caused a young, healthy woman to just drive her car off the road? Surely she saw the trees, but why hadn't she tried to avoid them? Coming up, an exhaustive investigation seems to lead to a dead end.
I was in fear that I would never find the truth behind this case or what caused Maureen to run off the road.
But then a routine test gives Robert the break he's looking for. Accident investigator Robert Jones is faced with a mysterious and strange crash site. On the way home from work, Maureen Weller suddenly veered into a tree, impaling her neck and severing a major artery. Unable to survive almost total blood loss, she dies within the hour. But why did Maureen's car leave the road in the first place?
At this point, I have no answers in my investigation. I'm still looking for any clue that could lead me to what happened here. My next step is to go to the garage and conduct what I call a vehicle autopsy. I will examine the vehicle from top to bottom look for any kind of mechanical failures, anything that could give me some answers in this investigation.
But the only information that Robert can take away from the mechanical inspection is the approximate speed and the fact that Maureen was not wearing her seatbelt. This opens up another possibility. Maybe the crash was deliberate.
Anytime there's a single car accident, such as this one, and the driver is killed, I always have to consider suicide.
Robert will need to meet again with Mrs. Weller to see if he can gather more background information on her daughter. This second meeting is calmer but still heartbreakingly sad. Mrs. Weller tells Robert that Maureen was a happy girl. She had many friends, had been accepted into the university of her choice, and was excited to spend the summer working at the house painting job. She had no medical problems and was certainly not suicidal. She tells Robert that if Maureen ever drank, it was the occasional beer. Not only because she was underage, it just wasn't who she was.
She informed me that Maureen had just taken a job painting houses for a painting company. So I'm going to find out what her condition was during the course of the day and see if there's anything they can tell me about this investigation.
Robert drives to the work site and Maureen's bosses are stunned by the news. His first question is whether she had been drinking before she left for home. They tell Robert that they ended their shift with a beer, but insist that Maureen only drank a few sips.
So now my investigation reveals that Maureen wasn't depressed. She wasn't taking any kind of drugs or medication. There's that possibility that maybe she had a little alcohol, but she wasn't a heavy drinker. Normally in an accident investigation, there's physical evidence there. There's everything you need to put the pieces back together and put the puzzle back together. And everything usually fits. You usually have all the answers within a few days. But in this case, I don't.
By now, it's 5 p.m. in the afternoon, about the same time that Maureen left her job the day before. Robert decides to head back out to the crash site. As he examines the scene a second time, Robert realizes that the sun may have blinded Maureen and could be a factor in this case.
I walked around and I started thinking, wow, the sun shining in the windshield of the car, it's a possibility, and it's something I'm considering at this point.
Okay, so you're driving down the road and the sun's really bright in your eyes. What do? Well, you can start with sunglasses. Sunglasses are a good help, but that's not enough. The sun's really low. How about the visor? Now that makes it so you can see. Could the sun have played a role in this crash? Could it have blinded a lady when she went into the tree? It's possible. Robert's going to have to consider that as one of his explanations in this crash.
The next morning, Robert returns to the hospital for the toxicology report. As he suspected, there is no evidence to suggest that Maureen was impaired.
There was no drugs, no medication, just the slightest bit of alcohol, which would indicate that she only had a few sips of beer. But there was something that caught my attention on the report. It was an EBV virus, and it was puzzling to me. I had to find out what that was.
Epstein-Barr virus it's like a lot of diseases. There's different ways it's expressed. And one of the common things it causes is mononucleosis. And it's something that teenagers get a lot because you generally don't develop it unless you're run down to begin with. And it starts out with a sore throat. You really can't stay awake. It's something you could easily ignore until you really are very ill.
This is a stunning revelation. A person suffering from mononucleosis would have a much greater likelihood of falling asleep behind the wheel and not waking up once the car went off the road.
When I found out what EBV was, mononucleosis, which is a sleeping sickness, finally, the final piece of the puzzle fit together and the whole investigation has been concluded.
After a difficult 10-day investigation, Robert can now paint a clear picture of the events leading up to Maureen's fatal and tragic crash. Probably a week or so before Maureen Weller receives her college admission letter, she contracts the EBV virus. Her new job painting houses is hard physical labor outside in the burning sun, and she puts down her increasing sense of fatigue to the long hours. But on that final day, the virus takes hold of her weary body completely. On the drive home, the sunshine acts as a powerful sedative for Maureen, coupled with her long day and a few sips of beer after work. She nods off at the wheel and quickly falls into such a deep sleep that even when her car rolls off the roadway, she doesn't wake up. She hits a tree and one of the branches severs her carotid artery. Maureen Weller dies within an hour from almost total blood loss. Mrs. Weller remains devastated by the loss of her young daughter, but she takes some comfort in finally putting to rest the questions surrounding her untimely death.
Once I found out about the mononucleosis, I had the answer I was looking for. I was able to go back to Mrs. Weller and tell her what my findings were and what caused this collision to occur.
Coming up, a boy is killed when a car leaves the road and crashes into the corn stand he's attending. But the case takes a stunning turn when a witness suggests that the driver may have done it intentionally.
Usually when drivers lose control of their vehicle or not paying attention, go off the road, and either use their brakes or swerve because no one wants to hit something while they're driving a car. But he didn't exhibit that kind of behavior.
A good accident investigator is kind of like a jack of all trades. He needs to have good police investigative skills, have some understanding of some of the basic sciences like physics and mechanics, but he's also got to understand a little bit about medicine, because we know crashes can injure people, but can work the other way around. Sometimes the human factor and something about the body can lead to a crash.
On a hot summer morning, Donald Morris takes the scenic route home from church. His friend Valerie is following in her car behind him. Donald has invited her over for lunch, but decides to stop at a neighboring farm first to buy some fresh corn. Just up the road, Danny Carlton is helping his dad out for the summer.
Here you go, sir. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Bye.
Traffic is normally heavier on the weekend, so Danny is expecting a busy day. But Danny could have never expected what would happen next. Accident investigator Frank Carson is on his way to the office when he gets the call about a pedestrian crash. Before he joined the police 9 years earlier, Frank spent 8 years working as an EMS personnel, so he knows all too well how devastating this type of collision can be.
When a car hits a pedestrian, you've got a 40,000-pound vehicle hitting a 150-pound person, and the winner's usually pretty clear.
When Frank arrives on the scene, Danny Carlton has already been taken to the hospital. The responding officer tells Frank that the victim has suffered some head injuries and serious trauma to his chest. But as an accident investigator, Frank knows that injury analysis is only one part of his job. He will need to scrutinize every aspect of the crash in order to determine exactly what happened here.
What the officer told me was he had two witnesses. One was walking down the street when the accident occurred, and the other one was driving behind Mr. Morris. He told me that Mr. Morris's car had run into the corn for sale stand, and that's about all I had to start out with.
Frank soon realizes that the corn stand has been completely destroyed by Morris's car, which now sits on top of the crushed table. A few meters away, Donald and Valerie are sitting on the lawn. The officer tells Frank that the uninjured Morris has remained surprisingly calm since he got out of his car and has barely said a word.
People's reactions after they're in a crash vary from person to person.
You Donald?
But they're generally pretty easy to offer what happened in the crash.
Do me a favor, Valerie. Could you go and stand by your car?
When I interviewed Donald Morris, he seemed a little bit out of it, but it didn't strike me as being from alcohol or drugs. He was confused. He answered my questions, but kind of had to pull the answers out of him by asking the appropriate questions.
The interview plods along at a slow pace. Donald tells Frank that he remembers seeing the corn sign. But after that point, he claims he doesn't recall anything until his friend started knocking on his car window.
I'm sure he was in shock from having been in a crash, but his behavior just seemed a little bit different from what I'd seen in the past.
Then, as part of his routine line of questioning, Frank asks Donald whether he's taking any medication.
Mr. Morris was very surprising in that he knew a lot about the medication he was taking, and he knew the names. He could describe them in detail.
When Frank recognizes the type of medication Morris has to take daily, he immediately realizes that his investigation has taken a turn in an uncommon direction. When he questions Donald about his condition, Morris calmly confirms to him that he is schizophrenic.
Schizophrenia is one of a collection of conditions called psychotic disorders. A psychosis is a condition where someone loses their ability to distinguish what's real from what is unreal. And a person with schizophrenia generally has hallucinations that they hear, voices. There may be things that they see, but any of the senses may be affected.
Feeling pretty good?
Yeah.
But like many other people living with his condition, Morris holds a valid and unrestricted driver's license.
What's the last thing you remember before all this?
In most jurisdictions, schizophrenics are considered to be safe drivers, given, of course, that their condition is correctly medicated. As an officer escorts Morris to a police car, Frank turns his attention to the witnesses. He starts with Valerie Barker, Donald's friend.
Valerie told me that she had been following Mr. Morris, and she said that he had been driving just fine for several miles, and suddenly when they got towards the corn stand, he just seemed to veer off the road. She didn't see any brake lights. As soon as the crash occurred, Valerie got out of her car and went over to see if she could help anybody. And when she went to Mr. Morris's car, he was wearing a seatbelt. He was slumped over in his seat, seemed to be groggy, and just like he had just woken up and didn't know what was going on and what had happened to him.
Listen, Donald, try to get out of the car, okay?
Where were you?
However, the customer's account of the accident is a little different. The man tells Frank that he heard Donald's car accelerate, then saw him drive directly towards the corn stand. The customer insists that Morris made no attempt to avoid the stand. In fact, he doesn't think the crash was an accident at all.
That was his impression of the crash, that he did it on purpose.
After this revelation, Frank is faced with one very odd possibility.
Some possible explanations for the crash could include auditory hallucinations that tell the person to kill or hurt someone else.
Could Donald Morris's condition have caused him to run over Danny Carlton deliberately? Morris does not seem to be paranoid or aggressive at all. He insists that he is very disciplined at taking his medication and that he has not experienced a psychotic episode in many years.
Mr. Morris was actually a very cooperative driver, one of the more cooperative ones I've dealt with.
With witnesses offering conflicting versions of the crash, Frank turns his attention to the roadway evidence. The final resting point of Donald's car tells Frank that he was probably traveling well within the speed limit. But the absence of tire marks on the asphalt confirms that Donald made no attempt to avoid the collision.
Usually when drivers lose control of their vehicle or are not paying attention, go off the road and either use their brakes or swerve because no one wants to hit something while they're driving a car. But he didn't exhibit that kind of behavior.
As he wraps up his investigation at the scene, Frank receives an important phone call from the hospital.
I received a phone call from the hospital about an hour after I was on the scene. The hospital personnel told me Danny Carlton had in fact died from the injuries that he sustained in the crash.
How long ago?
When Donald's car violently collided with the corn stand, the force was transmitted directly through the table and into Danny's chest, resulting in massive internal injuries. A few minutes after arriving at the hospital, Danny Carlton dies from internal bleeding.
Not that any crash isn't important to investigate, but now someone's life has been lost. And so that puts a little bit more pressure on you as an investigator to find out exactly how the crash happened, why it happened. First of all, did Mr. Morris do it on purpose? The other possibility is he had a blackout, maybe a reaction from the medication he was taking, maybe he wasn't taking his medication properly. And because Mr. Morris is being at fault for the collision, at least at this point, well, he could be facing some pretty serious charges.
Coming up, a mysterious bruise on the suspect's nose sends investigator Frank Carson on a new trail.
It didn't look like it was brand new. It looked like it was about a day old. So then I'm thinking that maybe he had some kind of trauma the day before.
A boy is killed when a car leaves the road and crashes into the corn stand he's attending. Investigator Frank Carson learns that the driver is schizophrenic and suspects that the cause of the crash may have something to do with his condition. When the first paramedics arrived on the scene, Donald Morris refused medical assistance. But now Frank notices a small laceration on his nose.
It didn't look like it was brand new. It looked like it was about a day old. So then I'm thinking that maybe he had some kind of trauma the day before.
When Frank questions him about his nose, Donald explains that he had slipped the day before and hit his face on the kitchen counter.
And I asked him why he fell, if he tripped over something. He said no, he just kind of felt dizzy and he fell, and the next thing he remembered, he was getting up off the floor. So that leads me to think at this point that, okay, maybe he has an underlying medical condition that made him fall the day before, and maybe he's having that same problem today.
In order to sort through the possible causes for the crash, Frank convinces Donald to seek medical treatment and accompanies him to the closest ER. At the hospital, Donald Morris is admitted right away and seen by Dr. Vanessa Brown. The doctor quickly orders a blood test. She wants to check for the presence of alcohol or drugs in the suspect's system. But in order to rule out the other possible causes for the crash, a number of other tests will have to be run.
One of the more important things I wanted to see from the blood tests was to check and see if Mr. Morris's medication that he was supposed to be taking for his mental problems was at a nice therapeutic level, meaning he was taking his medication the way he's supposed to, and they were doing what they were supposed to, keep him emotionally and psychologically level and able to function properly.
Since he had fallen the day before in his kitchen, Morris undergoes a CT scan to rule out the possibility that any head injury may have caused his strange behavior. In the meantime, Frank meets with Dr. Brown to discuss the results of the blood test that just came in.
Well, the test showed that the medication level in his bloodstream was appropriate, and he hadn't been consuming any alcohol or any other drugs that might impair his driving.
Those results rule out a psychotic episode, and Frank is inclined to dismiss the deliberate hit theory. On her side, Dr. Brown rules out the possibility that there was a complication with one of Donald's prescriptions. None of the drugs he was on were known to cause blackouts.
The doctor was of the opinion that Mr. Morris was just pretending that he didn't remember anything because he'd hit a pedestrian, he'd killed somebody, and he just didn't want to accept responsibility for that. I disagreed with that, just based on my experience and dealing with people for the years I have. I just had the impression there's something else going on.
Mr. Morris. Frank goes back to Donald Morris to ask whether he can remember anything else about the crash. But the more Frank talks to him, the more he's convinced that Morris is not lying about the blackout.
Have the doctors looked at that? The doctor thought that he was just lying to me, but when people lie, their stories tend to change a little bit over time. Little details change, but Mr. Morris's story had been consistent. Every time I talked to him, he told me the exact same story, as did the witnesses, which led me to believe that there's just got to be something else going on here. What did your test show? Anything?
Frank then tries to convince Dr. Brown to refer Donald to a neurologist for more tests. It's not an easy task. Dr. Brown informs him that Morris's CT scan revealed no abnormality and that she could find no medical grounds to explain the crash. But Frank is persistent and pushes hard for the referral.
I explained to Dr. Brown that this man was facing very serious charges, motor vehicle manslaughter charges that can carry a very heavy penalty in jail time. And it was my responsibility to do a thorough investigation and rule in or rule out the possibility of a medical problem.
Can you run it? Okay, we'll run.
Finally, the doctor agrees to schedule a full neurological exam for the next day, and Donald Morris is admitted overnight.
Hi, how are you doing?
The following morning, Frank arrives at the hospital and meets again with Donald Morris.
I told Mr. Morris that there may be some other tests that he's going to go through to help tell whether or not he had a medical condition and what may have caused his blackout. He claims he blacked out, so we can run some tests, hopefully, to see what caused that, if indeed he did black out.
In one of the tests, Donald is laid on a table as it is tilted up and down at timed angles to monitor his blood pressure and pulse. The test is performed to detect a rare disorder that can have an effect over a person's blood pressure. If Donald Morris has this condition, this could confirm his version that he had suffered an unexpected blackout just before the crash. Frank waits anxiously outside the exam room. When Dr. Brown comes out with the results, Frank breathes a sigh of relief. His intuition and determination have paid off.
Donald Morris, after the TIL test, was diagnosed with having neurocardiac syncope. It's also known as neurogenic syncope.
Neurogenic syncope is an extremely rare cardiovascular problem that has no relation whatsoever to Donald Morris's schizophrenia. With the diagnosis in hand, Frank can finally replay the events that led to Danny Carlton's tragic death. On a hot summer morning, Donald Morris is driving his car back from church while his friend Valerie follows closely behind. Suddenly, due to a medical condition Donald wasn't aware of, his brain sends a false message to his heart, resulting in a sudden drop in his blood pressure. As Donald passes out, his car leaves the road and heads straight for the corn stand. Danny Carlton suffers massive internal injuries and dies an hour later in the hospital.
Donald! Donald! Are you okay?
Unaware of what has just happened, Donald slowly regains consciousness with no memory of the accident.
This is a very interesting case, a very special case. First of all, we have cases where people driving their cars drive off the road, run into a tree, and they're killed in the crash. But we never know exactly what made them run off the road and run into that tree. The interesting part about this is that we were able to find out exactly what caused Mr. Morris's problem. Mr. Morris had an undiagnosed and unknown medical condition to him.
As a result of Frank's investigation, no criminal charges were filed against Donald Morris. And when Frank advised Danny Carlton's family of the cause of the crash, they also decided not to pursue a lawsuit.
So he was not prosecuted. And ultimately, although it was a tragic case, somebody did die. I think that was probably the right decision to make for Mr. Morris and for everybody involved.
When you're working a crash scene, things aren't always the way they appear at first blush. Sometimes accident investigators have to give that crash scene a second, maybe a third look to get all the facts together. And that's what Frank had to do in this case. We can take that lesson to our own heart when we're driving. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Maybe you have to give something a second look. Drive safely.